Good evening, and thank you for joining us for tonight's live virtual program. I'm Miranda Restovich, Executive Director of the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities. Now in its 50th year, the LEH has long been dedicated to bringing high-quality humanities programs to audiences statewide and beyond. We work with scholars, cultural institutions, universities, and other key partners in nearly every aspect of our work, from publishing articles in our quarterly magazine, 64 Parishes, to creating spaces for family reading and engagement through our primetime programs. Tonight, we are delighted to partner with the Midlo Center for New Orleans Study at the University of New Orleans to bring you Breaking Ground, a conversation on French colonial era archaeological sites in New Orleans. Funding for tonight's program is made possible by the National Endowment for the Humanities in support of the agency's Night of Ideas 2021 partnership with the Cultural Services Division of the French Embassy in the United States. Additional support has been provided by our good friends at 89.9 WWNO. Joining us this evening to introduce our speakers is Dr. Mary Niall Mitchell, who directs the Midlo Center for New Orleans Studies at the University of New Orleans. Dr. Mitchell.
Hi, good evening. I'm Molly Mitchell, Director of the Midlo Center for New Orleans Studies and the Raphael Casimir Professor of History at the University of New Orleans. The Midlo Center is so happy to be co-sponsoring this event with our friends at LEH. Thank you all for coming, and I hope that virtual weariness aside, this program is reaching some who might have otherwise missed it. I'm especially happy this will be a conversation between Erin Greenwald and the Midlo Center's new Associate Director, Ryan Gray. Since joining us in January, Ryan has already enriched the center in new ways through his scholarship and public-facing work. So let me introduce our guest and his interviewer. Dr. D. Ryan Gray, our guest this evening, is the Richard Wayland Babel Endowed Professor in Anthropology and Associate Director of the Midlo Center for New Orleans Studies at UNO. Dr. Gray has worked in New Orleans archaeology for over 20 years with research at sites spanning the colonial era to World War II. He's committed to creating new opportunities for public engagement with the archaeology and material culture of the city. His book, Uprooted, Race, Public Housing, and the Archaeology of Four Lost New Orleans Neighborhoods, was published by the University of Alabama Press in 2020. Dr. Gray will be interviewed by Dr. Erin Greenwald, Vice President of Public Programs and Editor-in-Chief of 64 Parishes magazine at the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities. A historian of the French Atlantic world, Greenwald is the author of Marc-Antoine Caillot and the Company of the Indies in Louisiana, editor of A Company Man, the remarkable French Atlantic voyage of a clerk for the Company of the Indies, and curator of the Historic New Orleans Collection's tricentennial exhibition, New Orleans, the Founding Era. So welcome everyone. A few notes on program logistics that I'm passing along to you. This program is being live streamed via Zoom, webinar, and Facebook Live. And a recording of the program will be available online at 64parishes.org next week. At the end of the conversation, we will open up the session to audience questions. To submit a question, please hover over the toolbar at the bottom of your screen and select the Q&A icon. From there, you can type in your question for the presenters. Please welcome Ryan Gray and Erin Greenwald. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Ryan.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you?
I'm great. I'm going to start our slideshow here, and then we'll get going. How's that look? Looks okay?
Coming up.
Great. Well, thank you again for joining us. The LEH and the Midlo Center are really excited about tonight's program. You know, I personally am very enthusiastic about archaeology. I'm trained as a historian, but I think had I been better at math and science, I might have gone in a different direction. So we're thrilled to have you here and to benefit from your knowledge and your understanding of the archaeological landscape in New Orleans. I want to start by asking you a general question about what it means to be an archaeologist in a city like New Orleans. Are there particular advantages to being here, or I suspect maybe some challenges?
There are. I'm sorry, is everyone seeing the slides now?
Mhm.
All right, excellent. There are really many ways to be an archaeologist in the city of New Orleans. And over my time here, I think I've cycled through most of them. The first thing that I did in New Orleans after I moved here, I started out with an intention of being a Mayan epigrapher.
I'm ready.
And then I moved to New Orleans to try to get closer to Latin America, and worked in retail for a while, and then volunteered on an archaeological dig in the city. And that happened to be Chris Matthews' Archaeology and Treme project. And that was a big influence on getting me into historical archaeology. And that helped me get a job doing cultural resource management work, really all over the Southeast, but working for a company called Earth Search. And I kind of became—
What is that? What is cultural resource management, Brian?
Cultural resource management is basically archaeology that is contracted through private firms to help with compliance for federal projects. So projects that receive federal funding or are federal undertakings themselves, the agencies involved are actually required to take into account the effects of those undertakings on historic properties that might be adversely affected by them. And the historic property definition includes archaeological sites. So whenever a federal agency is doing something, say FEMA, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the Department of Housing and Urban Development through HANO, any of those things fall under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act.
Got it.
That private firms will often be contracted to mitigate the effects of those undertakings on archaeological resources. And mitigating the effects of the undertakings is kind of a fancy way of saying that they have people who go out and dig up those things and document the sites before they're destroyed by whatever's happening. So that's really the field that a lot of people who do undergraduate degrees in anthropology and do field schools in archaeology, it's a field that they can get jobs in very easily, especially if they don't mind moving around some and traveling to wherever the work happens to be. So I got a job doing that, and did that really for the better part of 10 years with Earth Search, and got more and more interested in the historical archaeology of New Orleans. Finally went back to graduate school after Hurricane Katrina, and then the timing was just right to end up here at the University of New Orleans. So I've volunteered, I've worked professionally in CRM, and now I do my own scholarly research here in the city and try to involve as many volunteers and other people as possible in that research. Now, I think you mentioned, there are definitely some issues that come with working and doing archaeology in a place like New Orleans. It is definitely not the easiest conditions in which to do archaeology, being at or below sea level in some places. Water is constantly a problem, and summers are definitely pretty intense for doing field work.
And a lot of the work for field work takes place in the summer, right? It's just kind of the nature of the cycle.
Yes, somehow, well, for me, the only time I have an opportunity to do a full-scale archaeological field school is during the summers. Mm-hmm. And so our students learn what it means to do archaeology in New Orleans in all its glory very, very quickly, with a July and August spent out digging here. dealing with the rain, dealing with the clay, dealing with the heat. It will definitely help you decide whether or not archaeology is for you in the long term.
I bet. And but there must be some pretty significant advantages too to being in New Orleans, a city that's got such a rich history. There's so much that's happened here over the 300 plus years of French and then Spanish and then American and then all of these, people who have lived here and called it home. But obviously before that, indigenous peoples, there's such a rich history here. Are people drawn to coming here to do field work?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think it's a place that many people who work in CRM are drawn to, because not only do you have this rich historical legacy, this rich archaeological record, but then you also have the draw of the city of New Orleans itself, and so you're willing to take on all the environmental hazards and jump into that. And then, because the history of the city is such an important part of the culture here, I think it's very rewarding that also you find people who are just so enthusiastic about it. There's such a sustained interest from the public, really, whenever we're doing projects that have a public-facing element. It really it helps you keep your own enthusiasm up to see the enthusiasm and interest of other people. And
yeah, we absolutely see that. I think we share that in the history profession, is that New Orleanians and Louisianans they enjoy their history. They like to talk about it. They like to discuss it. They like to learn more. I think we're really fortunate in that respect to be in the fields that we're in the place that we're in. I know the magazine 64 Parishes wouldn't be able to exist without the public love of history and culture that we have throughout the state. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about how a decision is made to pursue an archaeological excavation at a given site.
Yes, I mean, in an ideal world, we could just pick and choose the sites that really corresponded to what our research interests were. The sites that we thought were most important in a given time and place. But there are a lot of things that make that tricky. For one thing, there is actually access to properties. A lot of the places where we might be interested in doing an excavation are privately owned or developed, covered
or
over.
There's a building on top of it.
Buildings and and then it's also, the funding is an issue. Doing a full-scale archaeological dig can be time-consuming. It can be messy. It can be expensive if you incorporate all the different specialized analyses that it really takes to do a full, thorough report on a site.
Right, because the work is not just the digging in the dirt, this sifting through materials. That's just the very beginning of the work, right? And then you've got to go and you've got, ethnobotanists and zoologists potentially who are analyzing what's found.
Oh, absolutely. And an urban dig by its nature will have a large artifact assemblage produced as a result of excavations. And really, when it comes down to it, as far as time goes, the field part is the easy part. That part is over all too quickly, and then you're left with boxes and boxes of material that has to be cleaned and sorted and analyzed
and stored,
recorded
and cataloged. Yeah. My first real encounter with the volume of materials that can come out of the ground was when I was at the Historic New Orleans collection, and they have just, at this point, they probably have hundreds of boxes of artifacts from across the different properties where they've had excavations. And And it actually makes me wonder, what is the legal framework around excavations? Like how does the framework that you operate within, properties that you can have access to, you can't have access to, properties that mandate excavation versus those that don't, that you'd really like to explore. How does the legal framework impact the public's understanding of the history of a place?
Mhm. Yeah, there's a couple of aspects of that question. You know, because our efforts are constantly directed towards, or well, because the efforts of the private contracting companies who do work for federal compliance are directed towards specific projects receiving federal monies, those projects get a lot of attention and are held to a very high standard of what's done with them, um, of how they're reported, and really of the amount of money that goes into them. On the other hand, projects that are done on private property, there's really no obligation for that to be done.
Mhm.
So it is often just a matter of working out agreements on the fly between the archaeologist working on the site and the property owner with how best to manage the collection, with ensuring that there is adequate time to research the collection, and then to try to ensure that the collection somehow remains intact. Because in Louisiana, if artifacts are found on private property, those artifacts, unless they're donated, remain the property of that property owner. So,
Right.
when we work with private property owners, we'll often um, make some kind of agreement where, um, they will loan us the collection for however long it takes to
Mhm.
analyze it thoroughly, and then um, they'll have the option of taking it back or donating it to the lab facilities here.
Right.
And that's what people usually do because, usually the collections are large and
Right.
well, people just
And
don't,
dirty.
yeah, there's boxes of corroding metal
Mhm.
and broken pieces of glass. And once
Yeah.
people see, what the collection looks like, they usually think, well, this needs to be,
This
um,
is better with you.
yeah.
I want to turn our conversation toward a look at sites that can really help reveal the lives and experiences of some of New Orleans's earliest inhabitants. 3 years ago, New Orleans commemorated the 300th anniversary of the founding of the French settlement known as La Nouvelle-Orléans. But oral history traditions and archaeological evidence make clear that the French were not the first humans to occupy the bend in the river that's now home to the French Quarter. And of course, the French Quarter is named that because it's the original footprint of the French city. But can you tell us about specific sites where archaeological data has helped us understand the pre colonial environment? And what kinds of artifacts have helped you guys confirm Indigenous occupation?
Uh, Absolutely. The first archaeology that was done in Orleans Parish was actually directed towards this question of the indigenous occupants of the area, trying to define the chronology for when people first occupied lands here, and they settled on this group of sites in New Orleans East as a place to study this, the Big and Little Oak Island sites, what are called the
Mhm.
Littlewood sites, and defined what they called the Chifuncta culture, the first pottery producing culture of Southeast Louisiana, with with sites going back to as early as 1000 BCE. So we know that there's this long history of occupation almost as soon as the land is forming down in this part of the delta. And then we also know that this was an indigenous landscape right up until the time of the arrival of European colonizers. That being a big reason why the city was located where it was, as it was this confluence that attracted indigenous peoples. That has actually been a lot harder to trace archaeologically, though. It's a good thing that we have the historical accounts that talk about these different Native American village sites around Bayou St. John, and this kind of shifting landscape of tribal nations here, because the traces of those have been a lot harder to find archaeologically. This may be due to the fact that no one has really systematically looked for all of them,
Right.
that they proceeded piecemeal. Just when you get access to a property and you're able to test it, then you hope that there might be something there. Um,
Well, in the French Quarter, Ryan, wasn't there a situation where there was a property on Conti Street, and maybe this is, assumptions being made for a long time. There was this assumption that there hadn't been indigenous occupation on the site of the French Quarter. And is it possible that archaeologists simply didn't go down deep enough past the French colonial layers, and that the Conti Street excavation really was an eye opener, I think, for the entire field. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what it seemed like.
Yeah, I was actually working on that excavation and on the crew that found the Native American pottery and what we think is a pre-French colonial layer there, and that is the big issue. It's also an issue with finding good French colonial sites to excavate. The French colonial ground surface, pretty much anywhere in the modern, Vieux Carré, the French Quarter, that's going to be a good 2.5, 3 feet below the present day grade at least, and
Wow.
sometimes deeper than that, depending on how built up a given lot is. So then you have to go even farther beneath that to have any hope of finding traces of indigenous presence. And those traces, and I think we'll actually see some slides of it very soon as the slides rotate through, are often just a handful of pottery sherds buried in this really mucky clay,
Yeah.
that's hovering around the level of the water table, so that
Yeah. Do you ever have to use pumps on sites to clear out the water?
Absolutely. Yeah, and in this slideshow, when we see some slides of the St. Peter Street Cemetery later, then there are some examples there where we had to constantly pump out the water to be able to get things dry enough to excavate the burials on that site. The problem with using pumps in that kind of watery soil is that the mucky clays will actually foul up the pumps really quickly,
Oh, wow.
and then it's also really messy. So if you're working in the French Quarter, and you have neighbors who are, not really liking it if you're pumping out muddy, nasty water
Yeah.
into the street, then you have to deal with that as well. So it's just not easy to get to that.
Right. But when you do get to it, I mean, here's a good example in the slides right now. And these are pre-contact era pottery sherds from that 535 Conti Street site. What can artifacts like this and soil analysis tell us about these occupants, which I believe, is the consensus now that this is probably 17th century pottery? What can these kinds of artifacts and soil analysis tell us about those groups of people who lived here and maybe why they left?
Yeah, I mean, the excavations like at 535 Conti are really just such small windows that the main things that they can tell us are that we need to pay attention and keep looking. But because of the attention that excavation brought, I think people have been starting to look when they have an opportunity to open up wider areas and actually get better windows into those pre-colonial settlements. And I think already there's at least one more example along the riverfront in what's now the Lower Garden District, where there is a likely pre-colonial settlement that has been identified, where the colonial era material occurs just right on top of it. And I think in these older areas of the city along the riverfront, I think there are more examples of that this was a very active indigenous landscape all the way up to the time when Europeans arrived. You know?
Which is really, I think, humbling, I think, as a historian to think about, because, you know, in history, we deal with primarily paper. We deal with the written word, we deal with maps, records, and sometimes we borrow from other professions like archaeology. But I'm curious about this question related to indigenous occupation, because there's so little said about it in the written record, even for the early contact period. Yes, in the broader Louisiana, we know there are Native Americans everywhere, but they don't show up as often in the historical record in the 1720s and 30s within the urban environment as they in fact were. You know, we know that they were here. We can see their presence through trade goods, through pottery that may have been traded for, you know, bear oil or something like that. What can archaeology tell us that traditional historical research can't? Like, how are those two professions different, and how do they work hand in hand?
Yeah, I think one of the things that archaeology has the potential to help us sort out is really the nature of some of these contacts that people just aren't talking about in the written documents very much. Mm-hmm. You know, one of the things that is, for a long time, the people said about New Orleans is that it was unusual in the fact that there was so little Native American pottery in colonial era assemblages. Mm-hmm. And now we know that that was probably skewed by the bias from the kinds of sites that were being excavated, because there are many sites that have been excavated in the past 10, 15 years where there's a really kind of astounding diversity of Native American pottery that has been recovered. One of the big issues is that we don't know where all it's coming from, though. We don't know which pottery is being made by people who are living close by, which is being made by indigenous people who are living within the city, which is being made potentially by indigenous people who are enslaved, because in the French era, we have Native American enslaved people as well. And even as that was supposedly banned in later colonial administrations, it now seems, based on the work of a number of historians, that those people were just reclassified, and mm-hmm. they became Black, because then that enabled them to still be eligible to be enslaved.
Right. I know that becomes particularly sticky in the Spanish period, when supposedly it is outlawed, but then there's just these kind of paper changes that take place. Some of the earliest excavations in the French Quarter date to the 1960s and 70s and targeted properties closely associated with the French period of settlement, which for the 18th century is, of course, 1718 to 1762. That end date's a little squishy depending on what you're using to quantify there. But can you tell us about those early excavations? Have the criteria for site selection changed over time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, many of those early excavations really relied on historic house museums to give archaeologists, while different renovations were happening, the opportunity to get in and try to answer questions about the chronology of mm-hmm. the building. The funny thing is, many of the buildings where the excavations were happening were later than the French colonial period, but people were still looking for information about the French colonial era. at the time, I think the granularity of the analyses were not good enough to really see the French era and separate it from the Spanish era in the archaeology. You know,
Sure.
our archaeological methods, especially for urban archaeology, have improved since the 1970s. And we
And
have
in what ways, Ryan?
we're much more aware of how the site is formed and of the importance of kind of separating out with great care the different sort of stratigraphic layers of the site. Sometimes the early generation of historical archaeologists, they would just dig in arbitrary layers and kind of put everything together from those layers going down, which is still helpful, but it doesn't really matter if you're mixing up two separate layers of soil. And so if you have things from the Spanish era mixed with the French era, then you can't really say anything about either one very well.
Right.
Also at the time, people were still kind of figuring out their typologies. Like it now seems a really convenient marker that, and I promise I'm not going to get started talking about English pottery and French pottery because that's kind of my thing. But English.
That's next week. That's next week.
Anyone who wants to hear more about that can come and hang out in the lab. But we know that English creamware gets introduced to Southeast Louisiana late in the 1760s or early in the 1770s, and then we know that if an assemblage has English creamware in it, then it's got to be from the Spanish era. So now we know what we're looking for when we're looking to find a pristine French colonial period soil. A lot of those early projects were really well intentioned,
Sure.
and were really productive, but they don't have very good French colonial components for scholarly study.
Interesting. I mean, it's really interesting to think about where New Orleans stands relative to sites of a similar vintage, right? Where does New Orleans fit within the kind of the spectrum of the French Atlantic world, stretching from New France and Canada to France itself to West Africa? Because that's something that we haven't actually talked about yet, is that we know that there's indigenous occupation on the site prior to the French arriving, and when the French are here, there's coexistent indigenous occupation. But then there's also this third group, which in itself is incredibly diverse, coming from all over West and West Central Africa through the African slave trade. And I think one of the things that I would love to see more of is research that tells us more about the lives of enslaved people. And I wonder if looking at the French Atlantic kind of broadly helps us do that. I'm thinking about Gorée off of the coast of Dakar in Senegal, or Saint Louis de Senegal. Like, how does New Orleans compare in both the number of sites we've excavated and the state of the field here to other sites in the French Atlantic, other 18th century French Atlantic sites?
Yeah, it really varies pretty wildly depending on where you are. The sites in French Canada are really well excavated, really well reported. There has been a very robust archaeological authority in Parks Canada for many years, even though they have their own funding issues lately, but they have done just remarkable work at getting information out there. There's a lot of new work happening in West Africa, especially in Senegal, that is really, a lot of it is directed towards filling in this blank when we talk about the um, what happens with populations who were enslaved once they arrived. There's this big question about what happens to African cultures and all their diversity after the arrival of enslaved people in the Americas. And then people realize when they were trying to study that in the Americas, there was very little archaeological work that had been done on what those cultures looked like in that same period of the transatlantic slave trade. So people are trying to make those connections now. Same thing in the Caribbean. There's a lot of variation. There's actually a good bit of archaeology that has been in the Caribbean because it's a very appealing place to hold field schools.
Oh, that's funny.
So,
I mean, it makes total sense. It's kind of like New Orleans or St. Augustine, I imagine. It's popular.
Yeah,
mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Some of the most interesting work that's happening in the Caribbean, in the French Caribbean, is work in Haiti, and I hope to learn more about that in the future. There's been some projects happening. It's a big challenge there because there has been so much loss of topsoil and sort of environmental degradation has affected what's preserved archaeologically as well. But still, I think there's a huge amount of potential to connect that work to work that's happening in New Orleans, and a couple of graduate students here who are interested in that particularly. And so I hope that we see those connections.
Yeah, I hope so too. I really do. What kinds of sites from the French colonial period have been excavated? I mean, I know we're looking right now at St. Anthony's Garden, right? Can you talk a little bit about the diversity of sites?
Yeah, it's funny. It's really a remarkably small number of well-preserved French colonial sites that have been excavated. And they really are weighted towards things that are related to colonial administration and to commerce. And even the deposits at St. Anthony's Garden, at least like one side of the garden was associated with the residence of the attorney in the French era, if I remember correctly. And then there's the garden on the other side and the Jesuits. So there's also, I'd say, a good bit related to looking at this sort of religious history. But there is really not that much where we have a sufficient exposure of the ground and of like good French era deposits to talk that much about everyday life, especially to really get at the everyday lives of people who were the kind of ordinary working people and the people who were enslaved in the French period. Although I think some of the work that we've been doing at 810 Royal Street is actually going to eventually fill in a little bit of that, but it's still just a tiny bit of what's out there.
Do you want to tell us about that site? It's coming up here in the slideshow, and maybe talk about the rather dramatic way in which that site became available for excavation. I was working in the quarter about 5 blocks away when it happened. If you want to just kind of let people know, and then please tell us about the site.
Yes, it was where a building that had been constructed around 1801, sometime between 1801 and 1803, collapsed rather dramatically in 2014. It had been neglected through most of the 20th century, although there were still apartments that were occupied upstairs at the time of the collapse. But there was water damage and termite damage, and the building ultimately just failed one day and kind of.
Yeah, we heard it. We were in the 500 block of Royal Street. So 3 blocks away, just 3 blocks away. And I remember people like rushing outside and you couldn't see anything because it was just dust everywhere. It was very dramatic, but that site has become really quite fruitful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was. We were invited by the new owner who purchased the lot after the collapse, and the new owner knew that it would take a while to get permits for new construction. Had dealt with the Vucre Commission before, and thought that it would be a nice way to make up for the loss of the historic building, to invite us in and let us have free access to the lot as long as it was available. That was in 2014. They still have not managed to get anything built there, though that they have been trying to get plans approved for some time now.
Right.
But many people think it's something because of what we found that prevented it, but there's nothing that required them to do archaeology there, and there's really nothing aside from human remains that we could find that would impede the development of the site. But it was such a fun place to work, and we did 2 summer field schools there. Just so many people pass by every day, and we would sometimes try to keep count of just how many visitors we talked to every day, and we usually give up at around 250 for the day. And you get to know all the neighborhood characters.
Yeah.
And it was just a lot of fun. And then being able to just point, and we had excavations at the very front of the lot where you could nicely and clearly see exposed in the wall from the street front, the layer of ash from the 1788 fire.
Right.
And being able to just point that out to people, and people always responded to that if they had any.
So it makes it real. It makes it real to them, because it's very hard, I think, if you look, I mean, some of these photographs, you look at them and you're like, okay, that's a muddy square. Mm-hmm. What am I looking at here? But if you can help people understand what they're looking at and why you do the work that you're doing, obviously people become quite fascinated. I mean, I think the vast majority of the questions that we're seeing in the Q&A relate to how people can, volunteer at archaeological sites, which we can talk about in a little bit. But there's this, I know we don't want to talk about that guy in the movies, but people they have a thing for archaeology. And I know that what Indiana Jones shows is absolute horse hockey relative to what the field is, and certainly the ethics of the field. But people find archaeology, I think, really interesting, which is, we have a lot of people on this program tonight that testifies to that. I want to ask you about a site that I'm particularly drawn to, and we're seeing some of the artifacts from it right now. The first time I heard about St. Peter's Cemetery, all I could think of is the movie Poltergeist, where, the scene in Poltergeist where the swimming pool has filled up with mud, and there are, a cemetery, a burial ground is coming alive in the cemetery that's in the swimming pool in the movie. And St. Peter's Street Cemetery is the city's earliest cemetery, despite the fact that it's the earliest cemetery, but there's no marker, there's no indication to the public that it exists. Most people think it's St. Louis number 1, which came far, far later, but St. Peter's Cemetery was established in the early 1720s in the block bounded by present-day Rampart, St. Peter, Burgundy, and Toulouse streets. And we know that it's St. Peter's Cemetery because at least 3 times in the last 45 years, 50 years, in 1972, 1984, and 2011, construction workers at the site one of those times trying to put in a pool, so very poltergeisty, have uncovered or hit coffins and have stopped work, obviously. And there have been these 3 different moments, because it's a full city block. The cemetery, I don't think, took up the entire city block initially, but it may have ultimately. And I know that you worked on that site, and I want to know, like, what can you tell us about the sensitivity of a site like that, but also what we can learn from an early site like that, which was in fact a cemetery that was not segregated as many later cemeteries were. What's it like to work on a site like that?
Well, I should mention that we actually did learn something from the fact that, so in 1972, the one time that it was discovered that you mentioned, it was hit when they were doing work at the Maison Dupuis Hotel. And actually a bottle hunter reported the coffins. And then in 1984, it was again reported. And by the time archaeologists were allowed access to the site, they at least were allowed access to the site, but they were given essentially a weekend to salvage burials that had already been exposed. And the forms, the foundations had already been poured by the time the archaeologists got access to the site. And when that actually taught something to the property owner who contacted us, because he actually contacted us before his workmen started installing the pool. And so we were actually able to go in and test first with a
Oh, good. Okay.
Louisiana. And then once we identified that there were, in fact, human remains where the pool was supposed to go in, we actually convinced him to change his plans a little bit to try to avoid some of them. And then we only went in and excavated the ones that would be disturbed by the construction plans. So that was kind of a new development in the history of the city for someone to actually be proactive.
Yeah, and I didn't know that. That's really interesting to know. And I wonder, for people who are familiar with the French Quarter, this is a block that is fully in commerce, right? There's a P&J Oyster has their processing facility on that block. There are many, many condos. There's a hotel. I mean, it's fully occupied, and it's a cemetery that I believe eventually filled up and was closed around 1800. But there are no legal protections in place for that site. Is that right?
Well, Louisiana actually has very specific laws about what can happen to cemeteries. And actually, Louisiana has some of the most restrictive laws in the country on what can happen to cemetery sites. However, it's very difficult if those sites have already been developed in the past and are now subdivided and covered with buildings and private property. That you can't really tell people that they have to move off of that property. The law doesn't specify that, but it does specify protections for the human remains there. It's just very hard to enforce it if it's on private property.
Yeah. What kinds of artifacts were recovered from the St. Peter site, and what happened to the human remains that were brought up?
Well,
that's it seems a very sensitive issue.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and it was one of those things where because the cemetery was used for such a long time, and because it served really all segments of New Orleans society.
Tell us a little bit about that. What do you mean by all segments?
In the burial records that have survived for St. Peter Street, there are French colonists, there are free people of color, there are people who are enslaved of both African and of Native American descent. Really all segments of the city's society were buried there, except for the very wealthy people who managed to get themselves put underneath the church,
Yeah, right.
where there are also still colonial era burials. But based on the burial records, we think there are at least 8,000 and maybe as many as 12,000 people still interred on the St. Peter Street Cemetery site. Many of them are deeply buried enough that they are below building foundations or below the extant foundations now. So while some have undoubtedly been disturbed over the years, there are still a lot of people's ancestors buried on that site. And so it's a very, to me, it's the most significant site on which I've worked in New Orleans, not just for its archaeological significance, but for its significance as an ancestral burial place.
Right.
And where of the human remains recovered so far, a disproportionate number of them have been people of African descent, many of whom were likely enslaved in their lives, just based on the demographics of the colony at that time. Here's the cemetery slides coming up again for people who've been looking for those. I'm sorry, I don't have the ability to pause, but they're cycling through now. And there's a lot that we can learn when we recover human remains archaeologically. We can look for all the sort of demographics of burial. We can look for signs of violence, of physical stress, of health-related stress. We can, for me, that's more the province of forensic anthropologists, and I left that to our colleagues with the FACES lab at LSU.
Right. What is the FACES lab, Ryan?
It's the forensics lab at LSU. Okay. And they're in some of the photographs. So these black and white photos are from the 1984 excavations, and you can see just how densely packed the burials there, the coffins are there. What really interests me is how it seems like the normal tradition for burial there, the kind of typical tradition for burial there, was to just wrap people in shrouds and put them in simple cypress coffins. But that means when we find objects that are interred with people intentionally, it tells us a lot more about what was important to that person or to their family in life. And so there are a couple of the more famous artifacts that we found in burials there that come up.
They're coming up.
Yeah. One from the 1984 excavations, this set of religious medallions that was interred with a man of African descent who had filed front teeth in a Central African tradition, or a likely Central African tradition. And then there's a smoking pipe that was part of a bundle from the excavations that we did in 2011. Now, we always incorporate a plan to reinter human remains when they're excavated. And after we recognized that these were mostly, if not all, people of African descent, we reached out to St. Augustine Catholic Church and arranged for a mass and ceremony going through St. Augustine to honor the Catholic, the African, and the indigenous background of the people who were interred there. Because, and I'm sorry, I get all excited about this excavation too. It's one of the things that we were surprised to see was that so many, or that a number of the people of African descent whose remains we recovered, or the people who were interpreted as being of African descent, also had shoveling of the incisors, indicating mixed Native American ancestry.
Mhm.
So sort of attesting to this long tradition of the entanglement of
Yeah,
African and Native American populations in Louisiana.
absolutely. I have a kind of pipe dream question. If you had permission to excavate any location in New Orleans, regardless of temporal chronology, it doesn't have to be French colonial, doesn't need to be in the French Quarter, which site would you choose, and why would you choose that site?
I mean, there are so many interesting sites, so much archaeological potential that is still relatively untapped in the city. The location of those Native American villages around Bayou St. John, it's amazing how little work has been done around Bayou St. John or
And
along.
that's older, right? That's slightly older.
Yeah, the colonial settlement potentially goes back to 1708, and then the indigenous settlement goes back long before, most likely. And
Yeah.
um, along the Gentilly Ridge, there's been practically nothing done. Um, uh, my own specialty in research is actually post-emancipation New Orleans, and I have lots of sites related to that I'm interested in. But I think the type of site that would add the most to New Orleans history, and if I could identify a good example and excavate it, it would be my sort of ideal site, would be sites associated with maroon communities and self-emancipated peoples, people who are fleeing enslavement,
Mhm.
and there that type of site can be very difficult to identify.
Right. We know they existed. We absolutely know they existed. There's plenty of historical evidence that they did, but figuring out where they are
Mhm.
is another matter.
And uh, they're sites that by their nature are often ephemeral. People are relying on being able to move quickly and
Right.
be invisible to the apparatus of the state and people who are trying to put them back into enslavement. Um, they're also in many areas that are um, where land is being lost rapidly. So some of the most famous sites, may be mostly underwater now. People have talked a lot about the San Malo, this community, and
Right.
it's probably underwater at this point. Although
Do you have
there
a sense of where that was, Ryan?
there it is generally thought to be in actually in St. Bernard Parish, but
Right.
I'm really hoping that one of the things that we can turn to in the future is actually a systematic attempt to identify sites associated with self-emancipated people. There are some graduate students at other places who have been doing some work on this. There are historians who have long been interested in this, and I think
Including Molly.
Mhm.
You're in a very good location for that subject.
Yeah, working with her and the Freedom on the Move project,
Right.
people who have been studying this for years, like Mr. Leon Waters.
Mhm.
There's so much knowledge to bring together, and I'm hoping that I can help the people on the archaeology side intersect with the people doing the historical research, um, and I hope we can, at the Midlo Center and through my work, support those people, because there's so much work to be done that I don't think it's all for me to do. I think there's a rising generation of young archaeologists and scholars uh, who can devote themselves to that, and we want to support that.
No, we look forward to seeing what's next. Now, I know there are folks out there in the digital audience who are wondering how they can learn more about archaeology in New Orleans. Are there particular resources you'd recommend? And are there any other ways that people can be involved directly in archaeology?
Well, we under normal circumstances are happy to have volunteers involved. Oh, and very appropriately, there's some of our most famous New Orleans archaeology volunteers of all time, Betty Pendley and Joan Bruder. Who,
two lovely women. I had the privilege of working with Betty Pendley at the Historic New Orleans Collection, and what a delightful person.
Yes, you could, for many years, depend on any time a call for volunteers went out for an archaeological dig, she would be the first person there and the last person to leave every time. She was an amazing lady. But yeah, we love to involve volunteers and the public in what we do. The coronavirus has, changed the dynamics of that a little bit, but we're hoping with vaccinations coming and things moving in the right direction in that sense, that we'll be able to start doing that work again. So people are welcome to reach out to me through UNO and through my UNO email or through the Midlo Center's site. We've just been updating it to incorporate some of my archaeology projects on there too. And there's some resources on New Orleans archaeology that are linked there now. And there are going to be more online archaeology resources coming live soon that people can
Great. That's
guess,
really great. I look forward to seeing that.
Mm-hmm.
I think, Ryan, we have reached the point in our conversation where we should open it up to the audience. So I'm going to stop sharing this. So it'll just be you and I here on the screen. And I've got a list here, and I'm just going to start lobbing audience questions at you. Lots of how do I volunteer? But here's a good one. Are there examples of artifacts recovered, say from the 60s or 70s or even 80s or 90s that have been in storage and are now being re-examined with new techniques, and that in turn leads to new understandings?
That is a wonderful question, and it's really one of the things that is perfect because it's one of the things that I didn't even really get to talk about. Collections-based research is so important in archaeology, and we are proud at UNO to be a deputy custodial facility for the state of Louisiana. So we have collections here that really, the goal is to make those collections available for research. That's what we are supposed to do as a curatorial facility, and we are slowly expanding and reorganizing. There wasn't a full-time archaeologist here for a while, and so things kind of lagged a little bit.
Sure.
But we're working on that, and one of the things that we're doing is actually looking at some of these collections from these Tchefuncte culture sites and incorporating them into some studies of long-term human impacts on the environment through, of all things, fish remains.
I noticed there were some fish remain slides, and I was hoping you would talk a little bit about them.
Yeah, it's animal bone there's so much we can learn from it, but it's also one of those things that is kind of the archaeologist's bane, because it takes a specialist to really analyze it, and especially fish bone. Fish bone is a pain to analyze, and there aren't that many people.
Why? What makes it a pain to analyze?
Well,
it's teeny, I imagine, is one thing.
Yep, and the differences that you're looking for to differentiate different species are often really small, and you need type collections to compare your archaeological specimens to. So you have to have an identified fish that's been defleshed, and that you can then compare each bone to.
Sounds very fussy and tedious.
Well, we're very fortunate to be working with a very talented zooarchaeologist as a research associate now, and he has helped us begin working with my colleague Martin O'Connell from our Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences and the Pontchartrain Institute. So we are trying to put together a project to use fish bone collagen from archaeological examples, from colonial era and 19th century examples, and from modern examples to look at stable isotope ratios, which have a correlation with changes in diet and the environment. And so we're using that as a way that we can use fish to get into what's happening in the Gulf through 3,000 years of human occupation.
That's really exciting, and something that probably hadn't occurred to many people as a way in to asking those questions. We've got more questions here. Do you or archaeologists generally ever meet with Native groups to see if they are able to help identify artifacts? And related to that, is there a procedure for excavations on tribal land?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. Actually, one of the slides that I put up with the Big Oak Island slides was a program that one of my predecessors at UNO began, called the Indian Youth Project, where they reached out to a number of the local tribes and arranged for teenagers from the tribes to come out and visit the excavations at Big Oak Island. And not many people at the time it was were doing that kind of outreach work, but it's a good reminder that when we talk about historic indigenous development, we're talking about tribal communities that also still exist in New Orleans, and that those historic indigenous communities are ancestral to. So because my main work is in the more recent past, I haven't done as much work with tribal communities as I'd like to, but it's one of the things that we're hoping to, inspired by that Indian Youth Project from 1982 to get going again. When there are projects that are on tribal lands, there are certain specific procedures that archaeologists must go through for consultation. And really all of these big federal compliance projects, there's a specific procedure where any federally recognized tribal communities with ancestral ties to that land are consulted or given the opportunity to comment on those projects. That mandate to involve federally recognized tribes actually is important, but it actually leaves out one of the biggest tribal communities in Southeast Louisiana,
Absolutely.
the United Homa Nation. So our goal for UNO Archaeology is to to try to go above and beyond that, and to try to develop these relationships. But for the most part, because excavating Native American sites is not really my specialty, I've got plenty to keep me busy in urban New Orleans itself, and so
yeah, you can't be everywhere at once. What's the most surprising thing that you've ever found on a dig? This is a question from Daniel.
Let's see. There have definitely been some odd and unusual things that came up. One of my favorite unusual objects, or kind of objects out of place, is actually not something that I found myself, but that was found on an excavation in Mid-City, where the medical center went in, and a well was being excavated, and at the bottom of the well they found a Zuni Oya from the 1880s. How that Zuni
ended up where it did?
I have no idea. We looked at all the census records and doing research for it. Couldn't find any connection to any of the people who lived at that address to the Zuni Pueblo. And it's interesting because it's at a time when there was really one person in particular who was taking as many of the Zuni pots from the Zuni Pueblo to the Smithsonian as he possibly could. And so trying to figure out how that one ended up in a well in Mid-City, New Orleans
Mid-City, New Orleans.
in 1900. I have no idea. But there are always odd things to be found in excavating 19th century outhouse pits and wells and things like that.
It's really, I think about, the outhouse is the garbage can, right?
Well,
and it's more than that, obviously.
The toilet that then gets reused as the garbage can too.
Right. Yeah. Let's see what we've got. Oh, here's a good one. New Orleans, we've touched several times on the water table in New Orleans, and not only the water table, but you're working in the summer when there is great likelihood that you're going to get perhaps some severe rain in the middle of a dig. If you have to use pumps on a site, how do you ensure that you're not removing items of interest?
Yeah. Well, we normally don't use pumps unless it's a really large area that's being excavated, and that's really well, for me, sometimes contract firms use them a lot more often. You can actually do a remarkable job when it pours down rain in the summer. Your excavation is going to fill up with water at some point. It's going to happen every time, and it's really surprising to people how neatly you can get the water out just by bailing it with buckets and then scooping it out. And then for some reason, it will often just, well, I guess it's the qualities of the soil, it'll inundate just the very top thin layer of soil, and you can scrape it off very carefully and actually not lose that much of the archaeological record. You learn lots of workarounds dealing with water and clay in New Orleans. Lots of ways to improvise.
Yeah, I bet. Also related to our living with so much water, there's another question from Sarah. She asks, has the history of levee building and other management of rivers and water levels in New Orleans, I suppose canals and things of that nature, affected the process of doing archaeological work? And has it also affected, oh, the question disappeared. That's okay. Has it affected the artifacts that you would normally find? Mm-hmm. And if that was not a coherent question because it disappeared, here it is. Has the history of levee building and water management essentially affected the process of doing archaeology, or has it affected the preservation of artifacts in situ?
Yeah, because there are some different parts of this. It definitely has had an impact on what we can get to, and especially thinking about the riverfront and the bachelor land and all of those things. It is something that we just have to constantly consider. Is this something that we can actually realistically get to? But because the levee system has been in place for so relatively long, between the natural levee and then the building on top of it, in some ways it has made it more possible to see when there are cataclysmic failures and connect those to specific to specific layers in the ground. When because there aren't these regular flood deposits building up like there were before we really intervened in how the river was forming natural levees and the back swamp. Now we can, when we see these unusual layers of silt in the ground, we can think, oh, is there something we can connect that to specifically with, but water management is one of those things that is constantly at the back of your mind as you think about just the infrastructure for moving water around the city.
Yeah.
That impacts what we find in many other ways too. The reason that privies get filled up with water is because a sewerage infrastructure is created that makes them less necessary, and then they're just holes in the ground, and then people dump stuff in them.
Yeah.
So almost always a privy will be filled, certain privies will be filled at the time a house is connected to city water, which kind of ties into this larger issue of water management.
A couple of people have questions related to archaeological reports, I think is what we're getting at here. There's someone who worked with the Deepwater Horizon shoreline cleanup and assessment teams after the horrible disaster of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill and then the subsequent cleanup along the entire Gulf Coast. And he says there were often archaeologists on the site, I imagine, because there was FEMA involvement. And many artifacts were discovered in that process. And folks want to know where they can, how or if they can access the report that finally comes out. We've talked a little bit about where artifacts go, depending on whether they're on private land or public land. But each site receives a unique code, right? And then theoretically, you should be able to go and look up the report for a given site and understand the history of the site, and then a little bit, depending on how long it's been since the excavations, there might be multiple reports. You get a better understanding of the significance of what was found and what it might tell us. But where are those reports housed?
Yeah, so the Louisiana Division of Archaeology keeps reports of every archaeological investigation that happens in the state on file. And they actually have an online database, but they don't make it publicly accessible because they are worried about the looting of archaeological sites, especially Native American sites. So because some of that information is sensitive, especially for sites that might contain burials, they're a little bit protective of the information. But when members of the public are interested in the archaeology that happened at a given site, it really is just a matter of you can request the report, identify who you are and you're interested in it, and the Division of Archaeology has lots of resources as well for people who want to learn more about the area's archaeology. There also will make reports available for anyone doing research on a given topic on a given site. One of the things that we're trying to do in the long term is figure out a way to share information with the public about New Orleans archaeology in a way that doesn't endanger any sites, but that gets out the information that people really want to learn. So we're looking at new models for ways to work with the city to do this, and hope that we have some progress there. The city has really been looking at archaeology more attentively than ever before, and for the first time ever, the city actually has an archaeologist who is looking at impacts from federal projects, for the city, actually embedded in city government. That's something that's required by the fact that those federal projects are getting money from FEMA. But we're hoping that there's a way that we can make that a more lasting part of how the city treats its archaeological resources. everyone thinks about the built environment, and for too long, the fact that there's also all of this history under the ground too has been kind of an afterthought.
It's good to hear that the city is really starting to think in new ways. I think we have time for one more question and to wrap us up. I know that you published a book last year. It's a beautiful book. I have it here. Everyone should check it out, Uprooted. But what's next for you, Ryan? What's next for you in the field?
Well, I mean, there's always more to be done here in the lab, and really one of my focuses these days is this sort of collections-based research. How do we bring together so much work that has been done, especially since Hurricane Katrina in the city? How do we bring that information together and manage it better and share it with the public better? And then we will still be doing different projects around the city and supporting others' research in the city too. But really one of the things that I'm hoping to do in the future is figure out a way to create a more diverse field in archaeology. You know, there is still a remarkable lack of representation in the field of archaeology by race. There are very few archaeologists of color, and I'm hoping that we can, in the long run, make UNO kind of a leader in helping to train a next generation of archaeologists, of Black archaeologists in the city. And so I'm hoping we have some new initiatives aimed towards that in the future, because it will add to the field immensely.
Absolutely. And, you know, keep us posted at the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities. We want to hear all about that. I want to apologize for everyone who's had questions that we haven't been able to get to. You're a very inquisitive bunch, which is wonderful. We're so happy to see the level of engagement that we've had tonight. I also want to thank the Midlo Center for New Orleans Studies at the University of New Orleans for co-hosting this with the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities, as well as thanking our funders. The National Endowment for the Humanities made this possible through a partnership with the French Embassy in the United States. So I really want to express our sincere thanks for making this possible. We love doing programs like this, even in the virtual environment, and we really appreciate it. Ryan, it's been a true pleasure. I look forward to running into you maybe after the pandemic is over. That is going to happen. I miss running into people. But thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me, and thanks to all the people who went into planning this, and all the people who've attended. And for those of you who had questions that we didn't get to, you are more than welcome to reach out to me directly. My email address is drgray, Gray, and then the number 1 at uno.edu, and you can find it on the UNO website very easily. But you're welcome to send me your messages, send me questions about volunteering, and I'll get back to you and get you on the list for whenever we can do any big public events in the future. But it's been a pleasure being here tonight. Thanks, Erin.
Thanks, Ryan. Good night. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone.